Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the first of two lectures on Lost Voices of the Holocaust. I'm Chavath Samuelson. I'm the Director of Jewish Studies. I'm also Irving and Miriam Low Professor of Modern Judaism and Origins Professor of History here at ASU. Those who have attended our programs in the past, you all know that in addition to undergraduate and graduate courses, we give major and certificates in Jewish studies, and also we offer a very robust public education program in which we explore the Jewish civilization from antiquity to the present. And we cover religious and cultural and literary and political, social, economic, scientific, and medical aspects of the Jewish experience. And we try to use as many disciplines as are relevant to do so. Although our public lectures, our seminars, our workshops and conferences and exhibits have engaged many topics, we're always committed to the historical perspective. We are convinced that there is no way to understand the present, let alone anticipate the future, without awareness of the past. Historical awareness and historical research thus undergird everything we offer to the public for the purpose of generating new knowledge and contributing to the quality of contemporary Jewish life. Now, as you well know, if you joined us for the last 2 weeks programs that we have done, we've devoted a lot of attention to the Israel-Hamas war, and we organized 2 public lectures on Zoom, of course, one on the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the attempts to resolve it. The first lecture on October 30th was delivered by Professor Victor Peskin, and the second one was on November 12th and delivered by Aryeh Saposnik of Ben-Gurion University in Israel. We will continue to offer those kind of programs as the painful and tragic situation in Israel continues to unfold. This evening, however, and also on Monday evening, I should remind you, we are going to focus our attention on another central dimension of contemporary Jewish existence, namely the Holocaust. And obviously, there's a direct connection between what's going on in the Middle East and the Holocaust. You are all familiar with it. The Holocaust takes center stage in the curriculum and public outreach of Jewish studies at ASU. In addition to offering lectures, research conferences, workshops, and historical exhibits, all of which are, or some of which at least, are supported by the Low Family Endowment on Holocaust and Genocide Education. We also participate in and support of the Genocide Awareness Week, which is a very unique focus on various aspects of the Holocaust and genocide. And in that context, we actually hosted Mr. Adam Milstein in April. I'll mention it in a few minutes again. Most uniquely, ASU Jewish Studies has been involved in an international effort to recover music composed by Jews who perished in the Holocaust. This is a rich and beautiful musical repertoire, and unfortunately, it has been suppressed or forgotten, and people are simply not familiar with that repertoire. At ASU, about 10 years ago, I started to collaborate with people in Los Angeles, primarily Robert Elias of the Rel Foundation, and we got involved in the recovery of this activity of this repertoire. In March 2012, we held a conference on, the title was Reimagining Erwin Schulhoff, Victor Ullmann, and the German Jewish Czech World. We focused on those 2 wonderful musicians, wonderful composers, and we tried to understand them in the cultural context of the German Jewish Czech world. In November 2013, we shifted our focus to the musical worlds of Polish Jews between 1920 and 1960, and we highlighted complex issues of identity, politics, and culture. We also collaborated with the Phoenix Symphonies. They had in their program 1 year a whole series of this kind of music, and we offer the lecture series that sheds light on this material. We also collaborated with Arizona Opera that produced the children opera Bundibar, which was composed by Casa and was performed in Theresienstadt concentration camp. All of those performances were wonderful. This collaboration between ASU Jewish Studies and the musical institutions in Phoenix was made possible through the efforts and energy of the late Mr. Robert Tanzer, to whom we are deeply indebted. He introduced me to Mr. Robert Elias, the executive director of the Orel Foundation at the time, and it was Mr. Elias who facilitated our work with the Colburn Conservatory in Los Angeles, where conductor James Conlon has been committed to the repertoire of Jewish musicians who lost their lives and whose music was suppressed by the policies of the Nazis. So this evening, I'm very delighted to introduce a protege, actually, of Robert Elias and James Conlon. That's Mr. Adam Milstein, a Los Angeles-based violinist who holds an artist diploma and Master of Music degree from the Colburn School, where he studied with a renowned pedagogue, Robert Lipset. Mr. Milstein holds a Bachelor of Musical Arts degree from the University of Michigan, and he is right now the program manager of the Zirin Conlon Initiative for Recovered Voices. This is a unique resource at the Colburn School in Los Angeles that promotes the study and performance of this repertoire. Mr. Milstein acted as curator for the initiative in 2021 under the title of Schulhof and More Project. And in that context, he organized and performed on film recording of the composer Irving Schulhof's music, some of which is on the album Shapeshifter, Music of Irving Schulhof, that was recorded under the Delos label. Mr. Milstein also has recorded the music of Franz Schreker and Paul Harman, and the person that is the focus of tonight's lecture, you can see his name here, which is not so easy to pronounce, Mieczysław Weinberg. That's our focus for tonight. So as an orchestral musician, Mr. Milstein has acted as concertmeister of the Sequoia Symphony and the Aspen Philharmonic Orchestra. He has played as guest associate concertmeister with the Baltimore Symphony and the Louisville Orchestra, and he has performed as a substitute with the LA Opera and the LA Chamber Orchestra, where he appeared also as a soloist, and additionally, he appeared as a soloist with US and international orchestras. So we were very lucky to host him, as I said earlier, the Genocide Awareness Week in April. And the lecture was so successful, and people just fell in love with him. And they said, you must bring him back. So that's what we're doing tonight. Tonight, he will shed light on survival, exile, and music under the shadow of Nazism and Stalinism by looking at this individual that you can now see on your screen. So Adam, the screen is yours. And we're all looking forward to your talk and your performance.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. And it's such an honor to present again for ASU. And I had, as Hava just mentioned, had the great pleasure of visiting the beautiful campus there for the past Genocide Awareness Week in April. And thank you so much, Hava, for organizing it. Really a pleasure. So as Hava mentioned, this evening, we're going to be speaking about a composer that I hold very near and dear to my heart, named Mieczysław Weinberg. Just a little bit about where I currently attend. I'm at the Colburn School, which is in downtown Los Angeles, just a couple blocks from where I am now. The Colburn School is home to multiple divisions, to a pre-college where I actually studied back in high school, to a dance academy, to an elite high school music academy, and also to a conservatory, which is a college level and a graduate level school, which I'm currently a part of. This conservatory has about 100 students that are all on full merit scholarships, where also, in addition to tuition being free, room and board is as well free. And we're there to study classical music, and it belongs to all orchestral musicians and also pianists. And something very unique about the Colburn School is that it's also home to the Zirin Conlon Initiative for Recovered Voices. And as Hava mentioned, the purpose of this initiative is to promote and perform music by composers that were suppressed as a result of Nazi policies from 1933 to 1945. The Nazis and their destruction destroyed not only millions of lives, but they also essentially got rid of the cultural milieu that existed in Europe that was very prominent and flourishing, with many Jewish, but also some non-Jewish artists and musicians alike that were some of them murdered, others displaced. And as a result, there's this whole treasure trove of wonderful music that deserves to be recognized alongside other great masters of the 20th century in terms of composition and part of the canon of Western art music that we just don't know as much about. And this is a direct result of the racial, genocidal, and political ideologies and policies of the Nazis and their collaborators. This initiative was founded by the philanthropist, LA-based philanthropist Marilyn Ziering, by James Conlon, who's the music director of the Los Angeles Opera and also the artistic director of Recovered Voices, and also Robert Elias, who is the founding director of Recovered Voices. So, and that's me there, and I'm a violinist, if I didn't mention that already. So today, as we talk about Mieczysław Weinberg, Weinberg was a Polish-born composer who is incredibly prolific in his output. He has a very fascinating life, and I'm going to delve in the first half of this talk into his life and sort of an overview of his biography. And then the second half will consist of a couple of pieces of music by Weinberg, just to give you a little snippet of his really tremendous compositional output and to give you a taste of a couple of his compositional styles. So Weinberg was born in Warsaw in 1919. His parents actually emigrated from Moldova. At that time, it was called Moldavia. His father, Shmuel, who you can actually see here on the far right in your screen in this picture. That's a photo of Shmuel with his two sisters, actually, back in Moldavia. He was the leader of a Jewish music and theater troupe. And he actually came to Warsaw only a couple of months prior to an infamous, horrible pogrom that happened in 1903 in Moldavia, in which two of Mieczysław's grandfathers and two of his great-grandfathers were murdered at the hands of anti-Semites in Moldavia. So Shmuel made it out before that happened. So Weinberg's first exposure to music was actually through the traditional Jewish theater and folk music that his father performed and directed as part of his theater troupe. So I wanted to read you actually a quote of Weinberg's about his early music-making days. He said that life was my first music teacher, since I was born into a family where my father had devoted himself to music since childhood. He was a violinist and a composer, but how can I put it? Not on a very high professional level. He traveled with touring Jewish theater companies and wrote music for them. During performances, he would sit at the conductor's music desk, playing the violin and conducting. From the age of 6, I tagged along behind him. I went to listen to all of those less than top quality, but always very sincere melodies. And you're going to hear later on in this presentation how the roots of his foundation in Jewish music actually comes out later on in his compositional output. And about his compositional output, here's another Weinberg quote from his musical origins as a composer. He wrote, "What does writing music mean to a child? I simply took one of my father's music sheets and scribbled down something or other, some clefs, some notes, without any intelligent meaning. But in this way, I studied music right from my birth, as it were. And when I wrote these operettas, I probably imagined myself to be a composer. But at the very beginning, there was my career as a pianist. At the age of 10 or 11, I was already playing the piano with my father at the theater." So as you can tell from this quote, Weinberg was always very humble, and this went out through his whole life, and he always sort of downplayed his talent and ability. But to those around him, it was incredibly obvious that he was a very talented young pianist and also an improviser. And he was primarily self-taught from the beginning at piano in this Jewish musical theater environment in which he was brought up. And after playing for a local teacher, she actually recommended that he joined the Warsaw Conservatory, which you can see a photo of right here. And he was recognized from an early age of being a wonderfully talented pianist. And he actually was working for his father and improvising and composing. And also something that's interesting to take note, that in the ripe age of 16 years old in 1936, he actually worked on his first of what would be many film scores on a film which was known on the British market as Happy Freddy, which is like a farcical, comical film about, I believe, like a telephone or something like that. And there's a lot of hijinks that happen. And anyway, Weinberg later on in his life would actually write on hundreds of film scores, even circus music. And there's one film that I wanted to bring to attention before I forget to do so, that he actually wrote the score for later on in his life, called Cranes Are Flying, which is a wonderful Soviet anti-war World War II film, which I highly recommend checking out. It's called Cranes Are Flying, and this would happen later on in Weinberg's life. So Weinberg was living and working and studying in Warsaw up until 1939, when the Nazis invaded Poland. And Weinberg was actually performing at a cafe as an improvising pianist up until 5 days prior to the invasion. His parents unfortunately decided to stay home. They made him a sandwich. He writes in his memoir, or excuse me, his letters, that his parents made him a sandwich, which was the final meal that he shared with them. And he set off on foot with his little sister Esther, and he went towards the border of the Soviet Union. After a while, unfortunately, Esther complained that her shoes hurt her feet too much, and she unfortunately decided to return to be back with her parents in Warsaw. And Weinberg, he would never see his family again, and he would learn many years later of their murder at the hands of the Nazis in Travniki. And I wanted to read to you another excerpt in Weinberg's own words about one of his experiences during his incredibly perilous journey escaping Warsaw, because in my opinion, and also Weinberg states this himself, that the war had a tremendous impact on a lot of his compositional output. So I think it's important to recognize some of his own experiences while fleeing the Nazis. So after 17 days, when he was completely alone and Germans were everywhere and he had basically nothing to eat, he actually found 12 other people on his way escaping, and he joined them. And he said that we caught sight of a road in front of us, perhaps half a kilometer away. 2 or 3 Jews were walking along the road. Their clothing revealed that they were Jews. At that moment, a motorcycle came along. A German got off, and from the gesticulation, we understood that he was asking for the way somewhere. They showed him precisely this way, that way, right, left. He probably said, Danke schön, sat down again, started the engine, and as the Jews resumed walking to send them on their way, he threw a hand grenade, which tore them to shreds. I could easily have died the same way as they did. On the whole, dying was easy. And that last sentence, I think, is very important, because Weinberg references this later on in his life, that he felt that much of his music that he wrote after the war was in commemoration of the horrors that befell mankind during war, and the fact that he survived held a lot of significance to him, and he felt that it was important to create a cultural contribution after his survival. So I wanted to just draw a special attention to that last line, that I could easily have died the same way as they did. When Weinberg made it to the border of the Soviet Union, he encountered German soldiers on one side, Soviets on the other side, and I wanted to read this detail of his experience there on the border. On the one side stood Hitler's soldiers, on the other, the Soviet border troops. In that moment, we were filled with gratitude, and we blessed the Red Army, which could save us from death. So, the Germans were on one side, their machine guns pointing at the line of demarcation, where thousands of Poles and Jews were waiting for permission to enter the Soviet territory. On the other side, there were mounted Soviet border guards. I shall never forget how mothers with their children hugged the horses' legs, pleading to be allowed to cross to the Soviet side as swiftly as possible. And finally, it happened. An order arrived to let the refugees enter. Some kind of troop was organized to examine the documents. When it was my turn, I was asked, family name, Weinberg. First name, Mieczysław. Mieczysław, what's that? Are you Jewish? Yes, Jewish. Then Moisey it is. So this final part is also interesting, because Weinberg's name was spelled in many different ways, and Moisey and different iterations of this imposed name actually made it confusing in years following for people to identify some of his compositions, and it's been a real point of contention to actually get his name Mieczysław recognized constantly with his compositions to help sort of organize the works and to aid people in actually finding them. So I wanted to draw attention to that point as well. So Weinberg made it to the border of the Soviet Union, and he went further east. He went to Minsk in Belarus. Even though he was a refugee, even though he didn't have really proper papers, he was still, at this point in time, treated pretty well by the Soviet Union, and the fact that they let him actually even enroll in the conservatory, where he actually excelled as a pianist. and he really started delving further into serious composition. And the photo that you can see here, you can see Weinberg seated on the far right of your screen with his composition teacher, Vasily Zolotaryov, and the other pupils in the Minsk Conservatory. And something that is very important for Weinberg's time in Minsk, although it was pretty brief, was that he discovered the music of a composer named Dmitry Shostakovich, which many of you may know Shostakovich's name, one of the most prominent and important composers of the 20th century, one of the most important Soviet composers ever. And when Weinberg first encountered Shostakovich's music, he wrote that it was literally like the discovery of a continent for him. That's how important Shostakovich was to Weinberg from a very young age. So Weinberg didn't spend that much time in Minsk. He was there, he studied a little longer, and actually just a few hours after his graduating concert on June 22nd, 1941, the Nazis attacked the USSR. And Weinberg, because he was a refugee and also he was Jewish and witnessed already firsthand some of the horrors of the Nazis, he understood that he was in a great amount of danger and had an immediate desire to flee and go further east and as far east maybe as possible. And he actually hopped on a train to Tashkent, Uzbekistan. And there are not details of Weinberg's travels there in particular. We know that it took probably about 2 weeks, but it was a very uncomfortable journey. And for Weinberg, what else is interesting is that he was able to totally avoid military service. And this was a result of his disease that he had, which was spinal tuberculosis, which you'll see in later photos of him. He started to develop kind of a hunched back, and that was a result of his poor health. And he was always very frail health conditions. Now, when Weinberg went east to Tashkent, the city actually became sort of a cultural hub because many members of the Soviet cultural intelligentsia, musicians, artists, writers, etc., tried going as far east as possible to avoid the borders where there was greater conflict with the Nazis. So there was actually a pretty flourishing artistic community there. And Weinberg began working, although not totally legally because he didn't have great papers, as I mentioned earlier, at the Uzbek Opera Theater. He started coaching singers there. And what was very important about coaching at the Uzbek Opera Theater is that he met his future father-in-law, a man named Solomon Mikhails. And Solomon was acting as the artistic director of the Uzbek Opera and Ballet Theater, and he was a very prominent member of the Soviet Jewish community, the theater community and the Jewish community at large. He was a very important figurehead for Jewish culture, and he was also the chairman of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, which was established following a brief pause in Stalin's anti-Semitic policies and practices, which happened during World War II, namely mostly for kind of propaganda purposes. This Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee was established, and Mikhails was the chairman of it. And what else is important about Mikhails is that, according to varying accounts, it's most likely that Solomon introduced Weinberg to Shostakovich. It was either Solomon or a man named Yuri Levitin who gave a copy of Weinberg's first symphony to Weinberg's hero at this time, Dmitry Shostakovich. Shostakovich saw the symphony, was so impressed with Weinberg's compositional style that he actually invited Weinberg out to Moscow in 1943. Weinberg and his first wife and his whole family, they all went to Moscow, and they ended up actually living on the same apartment block as Shostakovich. And Weinberg got to play a reduction of his first symphony for piano for Shostakovich, who was further impressed. And this began an incredibly fruitful collaboration and relationship between the two. Shostakovich and Weinberg became great friends. They collaborated on a lot of musical ideas. Some people argue that a lot of Jewish melodies that were utilized in Shostakovich's music could be attributed to introductions from Weinberg. There's a lot of arguments for that, but in any case, they shared many musical ideas, they dedicated works to each other. And also something interesting to note is that Weinberg's name was mentioned more in Shostakovich's diary than any other person. And they also would play often piano four-hand duets together, and they even premiered some of Shostakovich's symphonies for the first time in a piano four-hand reduction, which I don't know if anyone here has seen piano four-hands, but it's quite literally they would be playing sometimes on the same piano, two of them at once. So they had a very strong relationship and a bond. And in Weinberg's own words, he said that though many people think and have even written that I was a student of Shostakovich's, I never was one. But the Shostakovich School has been fundamental for my artistic work. Shostakovich helped me with many things, some of which I'm not even aware of myself. It seems that he took steps to evoke sympathy towards my music. I consider myself to be a happy man because I could show my works to the finest composer of the 20th century. This was an honor that subconsciously, so it seems, activated my writing of music. So you can really see, how highly Weinberg regarded Shostakovich, and so did many other composers of the era. Now, following World War II, more troubles really began for Weinberg and his immediate family. As I mentioned, a lot of the anti-Semitic policies of Stalin were on kind of a relative hold during World War II, but they came back really in full force following the war in what were called euphemistically anti-cosmopolitan campaigns, which were really campaigns against many prominent Jewish intellectuals and cultural leaders and Jewish Soviet Jews that were of prominence in society were attacked, sometimes tortured or murdered. And this actually happened in the case of Weinberg's father-in-law, Solomon Mikhels, who was murdered in 1948 by the KGB. And it is confirmed through letters that Stalin directly ordered his, quote, liquidation of Weinberg's father-in-law. And according to Weinberg's first wife, Mikhels's daughter, Natalia, she wrote that father's fate had been decided long before his physical annihilation, because in order to liquidate Jewish culture in the USSR, it was above all essential to get rid of its leading, I cannot see the bottom of my own screen. Maybe you guys can read the bottom of it. But to get rid of its leading members. I'm so sorry, but there's something going on my screen where I can't read the bottom of my own slide. So I'm sure you can read the very bottom of that quote. But this was a very important, horrible moment in Weinberg's life and the life of his family, because following the murder of his father-in-law, Weinberg himself was actually placed under constant surveillance by the KGB. According to Weinberg, for 5 years, from 1948 to 1953, they were following me, walking behind me. I wasn't allowed to travel. I was under surveillance, and the militia would appear at my place regularly or summon me to come to them. This was worse than prison. When they finally put me away, I sighed with relief because I knew it was going to happen. I remember that wherever I went, 2 of them would follow me, take notes, and write down the address. So as if Weinberg's life wasn't difficult enough already, he was put under this constant strain of being tracked and of being followed. And in some of his music that was written after this period, especially his 5th violin sonata, there is a sense of unease that I often interpret it as, this is of course my interpretation, being related to some of these constant anxieties that Weinberg felt. So to make matters even more complicated, in addition to the murder of his father-in-law in 1948, there was also the Prikaz number 17, or the infamous Order number 17, which was spearheaded by Andrei Zhdanov, who was a deputy for Stalin overseeing ideology, culture, and science. He was essentially like a propaganda minister. And the Prikaz 17 came after a series of composer plenums in which many Soviet composers were gathered together. They were castigated by Zhdanov and by other government bureaucrats who were on this campaign against formalism. They called it an anti-formalism campaign, which was essentially something that was enforced on Soviet composers, warning them of the detrimental influence of Western music on Soviet music, and to remind composers that they didn't have their own free will. They had to adhere to social responsibilities. And often this meant composing music that was less what they would have interpreted to be bourgeois and more of the people, quote unquote, more tuneful or utilizing Soviet or Russian folk themes. So in this order number 17, multiple works of Weinberg's were actually listed that could not be performed or played, and he was castigated in particular as being called a, quote, little Shostakovich, or this other group of composers called little Shostakoviches that were too influenced by the negative characteristics of Shostakovich's music, and Weinberg was listed as one of them. And he was also compared to negative aspects of Prokofiev's output. So eventually, Stalin declared the Prikaz number 17 unlawful in 1949. But as a result, though, many of these composers felt a very intense pressure from the government to not write things that could be interpreted as too formalistic, too formalist. And as a result, they were writing more, quote, music from the people. And this influenced Weinberg's musical output from 1949 to 1952. And he actually utilized many Jewish folk idioms, and he actually tapped into a lot of music from his parents' homeland of then Moldavia, which was at that time a part of the Soviet Union. So he would write a lot of heavily Jewish music, and some of it explicitly Jewish, and especially his Sinfonietta that he wrote during this period. And this would actually get him into quite a bit of trouble later on in 1953, when some of his cultural Jewish outputs, which were a reaction to this Prikaz 17, were then used against him. And also during this period, more attention was given to types of compositions that could draw less attention to themselves, so less, quote unquote, serious types of compositions. So for example, oftentimes quartets or symphonies, which were larger scale and sort of a higher type of high art compositionally speaking, could come under greater scrutiny. So Weinberg actually wrote less symphonies. He only wrote one during this period, and he actually, instead of writing full concertos, would write more concertinos or an improvisation for string quartet or a suite for orchestra. So less large pieces that could come under a greater magnification and scope. Another thing that I wanted to mention too is that Weinberg actually never considered himself a victim ever. And he was very clear on writing about that. And he would often downplay sort of the horrors of what was happening during this era, and sometimes would sort of, to paraphrase, would mention how other composers were complaining too much. But regardless, there was definitely a shift in his compositional output. And I'm going to be playing you some of these works that I've performed myself during this period to give you a sense of how he was writing. So at the end of 5 years of constant investigation, Weinberg was finally arrested himself by the KGB on February 6th of 1953. And this was actually immediately following a performance of one of his pieces called the Moldavian Rhapsody, which was championed by a very famous Soviet violinist named David Oistrakh. There's actually a recording of Oistrakh performing this. If you have Spotify, you can find it. But Weinberg was arrested that evening, where he was hosting a little get together, and at a time where he should have really been celebrating his great success of being performed by Oistrakh and having his music played. Quite the opposite happened. And this is a result, as I mentioned earlier, of an anti-cosmopolitan campaign. There was definitely, in the opinion of his first wife, there was definitely anti-Semitism that contributed directly to his arrest. But also, as I mentioned earlier, Weinberg himself was castigated by other composers, and there's some sense that some of these composers were also jealous of him, and people would really target each other and try to get each other arrested occasionally. And his first wife thought that could have had something to do with it as well. As I mentioned earlier, his creative output was used against him in his arrest, like as evidence of Jewish nationalism, which were some of the ludicrous charges that were presented to Weinberg, and in particular his Sinfonietta No. 1, which heavily utilizes Jewish themes. And what Weinberg was really charged with was trying to establish a Jewish republic in Crimea, which was completely falsified. And in Weinberg's own words, he said that when asked of the accusations, the investigator said, "Jewish bourgeois nationalism." I was still strutting, and I said, "Since I don't know a single letter of Yiddish, but have 2,000 books in Polish, Shouldn't you make it Polish bourgeois nationalism? And the answer was, we know better than you. So after this encounter, Weinberg was quickly whisked away to the infamous Lubyanka prison, which is a KGB stronghold. And he was sent into solitary confinement. And he was there for a period of a few months and was released in April 25th of 1953, following the death of Stalin, alongside thousands of other quote unquote political prisoners, many of them, of course, that were locked up for trumped up charges. And during this time, actually, as I mentioned, Shostakovich and Weinberg shared an incredibly strong bond. And Shostakovich actually created a petition and got other composers to sign it that were advocating for the innocence of Weinberg and advocating for his release. So Shostakovich did really go out of his way and put himself into potentially a politically very dangerous situation by advocating for Weinberg. And additionally, Shostakovich also agreed to adopt Weinberg's daughter in what they believed to be the very likely event that Weinberg could perhaps disappear, much like his father-in-law, or not return. And luckily that never came into fruition. And this contract that was drawn up of Shostakovich to adopt Weinberg's daughter, when Weinberg was returned from prison, they ritualistically burned that contract that Shostakovich had written about agreeing to adopt the daughter, which luckily never came into fruition. And also to note, in 53, when after Weinberg was released, he actually wrote his 5th violin sonata. And this violin sonata, I think, is an absolute masterpiece, incredibly technically challenging, but very powerful. And this sonata is dedicated to Dmitri Shostakovich. So there's a photo of Lubyanka prison in the current day behind this slide. But in Weinberg's words, he wrote that, "I was in a solitary cell where I could only sit, not lie down. At night, a very strong floodlight was occasionally turned on, so that it was impossible to sleep. There's not really much joy. Sometime around the 19th of February, the interrogator said to me enigmatically, 'Your little friends are pleading for you.' Well, I noted it. I did not begin to ask questions. I thought that it might be some kind of provocation. If I happened to mention a name, they would arrest that person." So in this quote, "the little friends are pleading for you," is a reference to the petition that Shostakovich had drawn up to try to get Weinberg released. So Weinberg ended up living the rest of his life in the Soviet Union. He passed away in 1996. One quote that I wanted to bring particular attention to that I referenced earlier is that many of my works are related to the theme of war. This, alas, was not my own choice. It was dictated by my fate, by the tragic fate of my relatives. I regard it as my moral duty to write about the war, about the horrors that befell mankind in our century. And Weinberg would continue to compose. He wrote hundreds of works. Him and Shostakovich were actually in a friendly competition about who could write more string quartets, and Weinberg ended up writing more. He wrote into the, I think, over 20 symphonies, actually, very powerful pieces. And he was championed by many of the great Soviet artists of the 20th century. And you can see some of them actually in this photo that I have here. You see David Oistrakh here on the left, Galina Vishnevskaya, who's a great singer, and also Mieczysław Rostropovich, who's the wonderful cellist that Weinberg actually dedicated his cello concerto to. In addition to these artists, Weinberg was also championed by Leonid Kogan, who was a wonderful Soviet violinist who Weinberg dedicated his violin concerto to, and also the Borodin Quartet. So following the dismantling of the USSR, Weinberg's career completely diminished. And also, we don't know him as much in the West, because during his life, he was behind the Iron Curtain and wasn't really championed in the West at all. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, it was even harder to have the proper recognition for Weinberg. But in recent years, there's been many attempts to shed more light on his music and onto his wonderful compositions. And just to note that he has 150 opus numbers, which include operas and concert pieces and film and circus music, as I mentioned before. So that's a brief overview of Weinberg's life in a nutshell. And I wanted to now transition to some musical performances. These are performances that I have played in myself. And the first work that I wanted to play for you are the first and second movements of Weinberg's piano trio in A minor, Opus 24. I performed this with cellist Clive Greensmith, who was a professor at Colburn and the former member of the Tokyo String Quartet, and also pianist Dominic Cayley. This work was written in 1945, and this is emblematic of the period prior to the Prikaz 17. There's a lot of intense emotion in this music. It's more modernist. It's in a style that could have been construed as more formalist. And I'm kind of throwing you a little bit into the deep end, perhaps sonically with some of this stuff, especially the second movement, the toccata. It's very intense, very aggressive, filled with, to my ears, a lot of anxiety. But also you'll see that in the second movement in particular, which is the fast toccata, there's actually bursts of klezmer music and Jewish folk idioms, especially the augmented second interval, which is very prominent in a lot of Jewish music. So throughout all this sort of modernist undertakings, you're going to hear also brief bursts of sort of a quote unquote Jewish folk sound. So these are the first and second movements of Weinberg's piano trio in A minor. Okay, so that was the prelude and the toccata, and very intense music, incredibly challenging technically. One of my favorite things to play. I think it's one of the greatest pieces of the 20th century. This whole piano trio. I highly recommend listening to the whole thing. But you could see how it could be perhaps classified as a kind of formalist in the sense that a lot of the Soviet like people like Zhdanov and these propaganda ministers, etc., were looking for music that was more quote unquote of the people and more tuneful. And as a result, a few years later, Weinberg wrote in this period post Prikaz 17 his string trio in 1950. And this work really explicitly utilizes Jewish folk music and kind of klezmer folk idioms that Weinberg most likely would have been exposed to in his youth through his father's Jewish music and theater groups. So I'm going to play for you the final movement of Weinberg's string trio. It's performed by myself, Cassie Drake on viola, and Nathan Moe on the cello. And the final piece that I'm going to be this evening, if I can get my slide to work, is Weinberg's Moldavian Rhapsody, which was written in 1951. This work utilizes Jewish folk music and themes from his parents' homeland of Moldavia. And this is actually the work that I mentioned earlier that David Oistrakh was performing the night that Weinberg was arrested in 1953. So this is a highly virtuosic piece for solo violin and piano, or solo violin and orchestra. And I'm playing it here with Dominic Cayley joining me again on the piano. So this is Weinberg's Moldavian Rhapsody. All right, so that is, oops, almost. That is all. Thank you all for being here. And again, thank you to Hava. And I also want to make a mention of this book, David Fanning's Mieczysław Weinberg in Search of Freedom. This is a great historical overview of Weinberg's life and includes where I got the quotes from Weinberg's letters and diaries, etc. There's some great photos in here as well. So if you're interested to learn more about Weinberg, this might be out of print, but you can still find it online, David Fanning's In Search of Freedom. So
Thank
anyway,
you
thank
so
you.
much, Adam. That was wonderful. This is Lisa Kaplan. Hava's electricity went out in the middle of Adam's lecture, so I will be fielding the Q&A and finishing the call for Jewish studies. But we wanted to just thank everyone and thank Adam for a wonderful, wonderful presentation. We do have a couple of questions.
Great.
And I'm curious. I know he really produced a lot in his lifetime, and yet as an American, I really had never heard of him before, and yet he lived a very long and prolific life. I mean, so how is it that his music was lost to us?
Well, I think, there's a couple of reasons for that, but I mean, one of the big reasons is that a lot of music behind the Iron Curtain, in particular, it was harder for it to get out to the West, and there was sort of more of a select few Soviet composers that kind of made it big on the West, and Weinberg, for whatever reason, was really not one of them. And then following the collapse of the USSR, his career just totally diminished, and he was even less known. There could be reasons. He never joined the Communist Party also, which perhaps could have something to do with it. I mean, I don't know exactly, but his suppression behind the Iron Curtain, I think, had a lot to do with the reason why we don't know him as well, especially in America. His music currently is being championed, I would say, a lot more in Europe. Actually, there's been recent recordings for Deutsche Grammophon, which is one of the best record labels of Weinberg's music. Gidon Kramer, who's a great violinist, performs his music frequently. And actually, one of the recent candidates for the Los Angeles Phil conducting job, Mirga, I'm kind of spacing on her full name, but she's recorded a lot of his symphonies as well. So in Europe, there seems to be more of a emphasis on Weinberg's music, but it still has yet to fully catch on in the US, which hopefully that trend will continue, so he's well known more.
I noticed that he had done a lot of film scores and even an opera. Have any of those been released, and are they accessible to people?
Yes. So his operas are accessible. They've been performed in Europe. They've also been performed in the US. One of them in particular is called The Passenger, which is super interesting. The Passenger is based off of originally, I think it was a radio play, I believe. And it's actually about the Holocaust, and it's about a few different people on a ship, a passenger ship, and discussing elements of their lived experience. And it's in multiple languages, actually, this opera. I think it can be found probably online. I mean, I know that there's recordings of it. That has been done in both in the US and in Europe. He also did an opera based off of Dostoevsky, The Idiot, which is a great opera as well. And for film, I highly recommend Cranes Are Flying. Highly recommend that film. It's a wonderful score, really powerful movie, and he wrote the score to that. And Kostakovich also wrote a lot of film scores too. But Weinberg, they didn't always give opus numbers to their film scores. They kind of were less during that period in the 20th century. Film was maybe a little more frowned upon than it is now to score for film. But Weinberg did a lot of that, and even writing for circus and for cartoons as well, to help support himself and his family.
Okay. Bjorn Krondorfer from our sister school at Northern Arizona University, who's the head of the Holocaust Studies Center there, is asking, when and how did you discover him and his music?
So I discovered Weinberg's music actually through an introduction from Robert Elias, who was mentioned earlier. I think I first discovered his music, it was definitely during COVID, maybe 3 years ago. And Bob had sent me a clip from the Arc Ensemble, which is the artist of the Royal Conservatory in Canada. And there's a man named Simon Weinberg there, and he's done tremendous work in bringing forward the music of Weinberg alongside a lot of other suppressed composers. And Simon Weinberg and Arc Ensemble made a brief synopsis of Weinberg's life with these really fabulous woodcuts. And Bob Elias actually sent me this video, and it featured some of Weinberg's music on it. So I got a snippet of Weinberg's life that was like partially animated through woodcuts, and also a glimpse of some of his piano quintet, which I'm actually going to be performing in about a month or so with some of my colleagues at Colburn. And from the second I heard the fourth movement of Weinberg's piano quintet, I was like totally captivated. So then I went deep and started researching more of Weinberg's music. I just found that there's so much there, and a lot of it has been recently republished. And so it's just been really exciting digging in and really trying to make his music, part of my own repertoire and music that I present to audiences all over the place. And I hope that it really starts catching on, because he wrote so much interesting stuff in a variety of styles, as well, as you could have seen from the musical excerpts here. I mean, some of his work during that post Prikaz 17 era, some of the more music of the people era is actually, it's really wonderful music as well. That's sometimes a little more audience friendly and accessible. So I like programming a lot of that, in addition to his more sort of intense, modernist, out there, extreme expressions of emotion.
Right. Thank you. The next question is from Victor Arano, and it's simple. What happened to his first wife?
Oh, that's a really good question. I actually, I hate to admit that I don't know the full answer to that. I mean, I know that they were divorced. They had children together. They ended up getting divorced, and Weinberg was eventually remarried. And interestingly enough, actually, too, with Weinberg's second wife, at the very end of his life, after also a long battle with Crohn's disease, he actually ended up converting to Russian Orthodox, which is really interesting. And no one fully knows why, but that happened actually at the very end of his life. Yeah, I'm sorry, that's the extent of what I can say. I'd love to look into that a little more.
Yeah, great. Okay. And the last question that we're going to take for tonight, because it's getting late, and we told you we'd keep this to an hour and a half. So is, could you tell us more about some of his Jewish musical idioms and that showed up in his pieces? I know there are specific modes and ornaments in klezmer. Thank you so much. And that's from Emma. I'm not sure how you pronounce your last name. Mones. Emma Mons. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I think definitely he utilizes multiple Jewish modes, and especially what this sort of augmented second that's found a lot in Jewish music, and especially in Eastern Eastern European Jewish music in particular. And that's super prominent in the Moldavian Rhapsody in particular, and the final movement of the string trio that you heard. Also, rhythmically speaking, there's kind of like an improvisatory style that is really prominent in I find in the Moldavian Rhapsody as well. And also like rhythmically, he the pushes and pulls and tempo and sort of this dance-like elements incorporated with the augmented second and some of these Jewish modes, I think really kind of solidified into a Jewish influenced sound, and the fact that he's actually quoting it from Moldavia, where his parents were from, where we know that he was exposed to the style of music when he was a child. So during this period, he wrote a lot that was inflected with these modes, that period of 1948 to 1953. And also Jewish themes happen throughout his later output as well. And one of his final symphonies is titled his Kaddish symphony as well. I think it's symphony number 21, and that was recorded. And someone actually wrote it, her full name, Mirga Krasnite Tyler, which I'm totally butchering her name, so I apologize. But Mirga has a wonderful recording of that symphony, the Kaddish, on Deutsche Grammophon. So there was Jewish themes that would definitely also come out in his later works as well.